Hello and good evening, everybody. Welcome to this webinar focused on the current situation and the future state of safeguarding in the Church of England. I'm Steve Reeves. I'm the Executive Director of Global Safeguarding and a former member of the Independent Safeguarding Board for the Church of England. We've got an absolutely fantastic panel for you this evening, who I'll introduce just in a moment, and a critically important subjects to discuss. Towards the end of our time together this evening, there'll be an opportunity to ask some questions. So please feel free to use that Q&A function on Zoom as we get towards the sort of midpoint of the evening. You're very welcome to this webinar. We're welcoming everybody who's attending. We're particularly thrilled to have such a diverse audience with us this evening, ranging from safeguarding specialists and LADOs to clergy, child rights activists, and a particular note, of course, survivors of abuse who are particularly welcome, and we welcome their contribution as well as everybody else's. The Church of England is the largest established church in the UK, and its position as such means that it's frequently at the heart of national and local events. When our head of state is crowned, it's the Archbishop of Canterbury in Westminster Abbey who places the crown on their head. When local people gather, it's frequently at the local church hall that serves as a venue. When a child attends a primary school, there's a 1 in 4 chance that they're attending a Church of England school in their local community. All of that said, the Church of England has no legal status or personality. It is a federation of autonomous office holders and institutions bound together by a common legal framework. Since 1919, Parliament has devolved responsibility to the Church of England to manage its own legislative affairs. This is currently done by the General Synod, which meets both in London and in York, and whose decisions have the full force and effect of an Act of Parliament. Over the last few months, we've seen devastating media coverage of Church of England safeguarding failures, and the reputation of the Church's capacity to safeguard children and adults at risk is in tatters. People have been harmed, and while the Archbishop of Canterbury has resigned, many view that those responsible have not been held to account. As revelations of Church of England's failure to safeguard people from the offending of John Smythe have dominated the headlines, many have criticised the approach taken by senior leaders of the Church more generally. While the trigger for the most recent public scrutiny is that review into the abuse perpetrated by John Smythe, the Church of England safeguarding arrangements have been the focus of multiple independent case reviews, intense media coverage, and detailed forensic analysis by IICSA, the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, over recent years. More recently, the Chair and Secretary of IICSA, Professor Alexis Jay, and John O'Brien, CBE, one of our guests this evening, published the Future of Church Safeguarding report, recommending radical change to the structure and organisation of the Church's safeguarding functions. A version of those recommendations is due for debate by members of the General Synod next week. In the last week or so, we've seen 2 significant interventions from the Charity Commission, focusing the minds of General Synod members on their role in safeguarding others, and the other requiring bishops to account for any perceived legal impediments they see to change. So where does the Church of England go from here? We're joined this evening by 4 guests with extensive and varied experience of engaging with the church safeguarding system. Dame Jaswinder Sanghera is a campaigner for the rights of victims of abuse and exploitation. Most recently, she was the church's own Independent Safeguarding Board survivor advocate. John O'Brien was the Secretary of the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, IICSA, and co-authored the Future of Church Safeguarding report, which concluded that church safeguarding falls below the standards expected and set by secular organisations. The Reverend Matthew Ineson is a survivor of church-related abuse, whose case was subject to an internal church review, which found multiple church safeguarding failures. The review saw the Bishop of Newcastle revoke former Archbishop of York John Sentimure's permission to officiate, but no sitting bishop has been held accountable for any of those failings. Gavin is a long-established campaigner on behalf of survivors of abuse and resigned his position from the Church of England's General Synod in 2023, citing the fact that the Church of England is not a safe place. This is your panel for the Evening, and I'll kick off with the first question, which is from your perspective as panel members, how do you assess the safeguarding capacity of the Church of England as we sit here in February 2025, and how has the Church found itself where it is? Can I kick off with Jaswinder Sanghera, who's muted?
Had to be one and it had to be me. I apologize. Can I start by thanking you, Steve, for organising this as Global Safeguarding, because those of you who know myself and Steve, since we were removed from our roles as independent board members, we have maintained a commitment to who we refer to as the ISB 11, the survivors who were literally, and I will use the word, dropped by the Church of England, in terms of these survivors had reviews pending and complaints pending against Church of England, and we were not allowed to take those cases forward. Those survivors, I do want to say, we still walk with you. You are still in that place of not being heard, and it's important that these events that we're doing are recognised. It's for you, everybody else across the Church of England that is not being heard in the capacity of being a victim or survivor. So from my perspective, I would say one of the things that the Church of England is not getting right fundamentally is that they are still not listening to victims and survivors. When I was enrolled as independent safeguarding advocate for those victim survivors, one of my duties was to engage with victim survivors, to hear what they were saying, to implement what they were saying, and to take it to the highest level, which I did, to Archbishop's Council. However, very often there was a feeling of it falling deaf ears. There was a reluctance to hear them. I remember engaging with survivors to write my report, and they all said to me consistently, and I'm talking around up to 80 survivors, Jaswinder, when we engage with the Church of England, our feeling is we're received as a nuisance. We're received as an irritant. We are received as a thorn in their side. We're not embraced. We're not even heard. And the title of my report was Don't Panic, Be Pastoral. And that came from survivors, because their sense was that when we go to them and we say what is not working, or what help and support we need is, there is an immediate panic in the room. So from my perspective, the church is not trauma informed. That is not new news. We know this. And how do we know this? We know this because this is what survivors are telling us. This is what victims are telling us. Until they tell us different, that is the position. From my perspective, there is no evidence from the Church of England to suggest the opposite is true. We are still hearing from victims and survivors who are telling us the church is not safe. It's not safe for us in terms of attendance, in terms of engagement. When I receive a letter from a clinical professor psychologist telling me I am an independent assessor for the Church of England, this is Professor David Glasgow. He writes to me when me and Steve were removed and he was watching what was happening. He says, I have been recruited by the Church of England to be an independent risk assessor. However, as an independent forensic and clinical psychologist, I have made the decision that the church is not safe. It's not safe for victims and survivors. And I want you to tell them that I now have little confidence in them and I need to step away from this organization until it is safe. This is a person who is in the space of working with victims and survivors on a daily basis, who is saying, I'm stepping away from this organization. And thankfully, pleased to say, Steve, he is now supporting the ISB 11, and he has written a report into the impact on those individuals. We have advocated that for over a year to the Church of England in terms of the re-traumatization of these individuals, and there has still been no response. So from my perspective, and I'll end on this, until the Church of England is willing to be informed by victims and survivors at their heart, for them to be at the table, for them to evidence acting upon what they're saying, the Church of England is not a safe place.
Thanks, Jaswinder. John, can I ask you?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I'll come at this a perspective of, as you said, of the IICSA report and then working with Alexis on the safeguarding report into the church. But let's deal with the safeguarding report first, because there was some criticism that we didn't go as far in the IICSA report as we did in the church safeguarding report. And there's a really simple reason for that. In IICSA, we had multiple investigations to look at. We had to limit each investigation to specific parts of that organisation, the bits that we felt were failing the most. What the safeguarding review in the church allowed us to do was do a much deeper dive into culture and practice of safeguarding in the church. And I just reflect everything that Jaswinder has said about victims. But if we actually look, I'll just read very quickly the main bullet points that we came up with, which was an analysis of the current operating model in the church. So a collapse of confidence in the present system of operational safeguarding, inconsistent safeguarding practice across different dioceses, inequality in funding and resources for safeguarding, data collection analysis patchy at best, definitions of safeguarding were vague and very often either misclassified safeguarding or classified something as an HR issue that was actually safeguarding, inappropriate use of safeguarding resources, and lack of independent scrutiny of safeguarding. And in every, I'd just like to talk briefly about each of those to say why we said what we said. So the collapse of confidence was simply, we were given initially 3 months to do this. We actually took 6 months in the end. So we decided we would visit a number of dioceses, and we picked dioceses that were carefully geographically spread across the UK to represent urban and rural areas. We'd visited 6 dioceses. We invited people to speak with us as we went to those dioceses, but we also did nearly a couple of hundred of online interviews with different people, and we accepted anybody. So safeguarding professionals in the church, we had bishops, we had priests, we had everybody, we had survivors. Everybody, to some extent, had low confidence or no confidence in the processes and procedures that were followed in the church. But what they were able to talk about most passionately was their diocese. And what emerged from this is you don't have one safeguarding process in the church. You have 42. They will say they have common policies, but the way those policies are implemented, the importance that's given to each part of those, the compliance with instructions that are issued by the National Safeguarding Team, whatever we think of them, was patchy to say the least. And one common thing we heard, because we pressed very hard on how much control individual bishops had on safeguarding their diocese, and therefore how much influence they had on whether it was good, bad, or indifferent. Everybody said, oh no, bishops have no ability to do this now. My bishop never interferes. But when we actually scratched the surface of that and said, but if a new bishop came in who had a different point of view, would that change safeguarding practice procedure in your diocese? Everybody said yes. So we do have 42 different safeguarding systems, and the stance of the bishop has an absolutely massive impact on the way that safeguarding is perceived and carried out in individual dioceses. So we did find 1 or 2 dioceses that at the time we looked at them were doing okay. But we found many more that weren't. And okay is not a green tick. It was just okay in comparison to some of the really poor practices we found across other dioceses we looked at. So that was about lack of confidence in the system in the church, but inconsistent safeguarding practice. So I'll quote the 2 that Alexis always quotes. We found safeguarding being used to dissuade and discourage parishioners who were adults and had no vulnerability of any sense, who were in a relationship with each other but not married to each other. That was one example where they were using safeguarding practice as a way to discourage that. We heard where the church HR procedures that should have been used, where members of the clergy bravely tried to stand up and say the church is not dealing with this safeguarding issue properly. We heard safeguarding measures being used as a way to quickly move those people out of their practice. We heard one extreme case where the person concerned lost both their job and their home within a 6-month period for an original complaint that was a member of the congregation saying that she worshipped too loudly. And so the reason I say this, it just shows that safeguarding is not consistent in the church. They stretch and change the meaning of safeguarding to deal with all sorts of different circumstances. And that is to the detriment of safeguarding, because that uses resources that are trained safeguarding professionals to do things, and while they're doing that, the eye is off the ball on safeguarding in the diocese. So we found lots of that. Inequality in funding and resources. I won't say which diocese, but we found one really big diocese with a small urban but a very big rural area, very big rural area, had 3 full-time professional safeguarding staff. Contrast that with some of the richer cities that we looked at, where the geographical area was small, the population might have been about the same as the other area, but the concentration of where they had to practice was very small, and they had 9 full-time safeguarding professionals. Now, I make no judgment on whether 9 was sufficient, but what we do know is 3 was certainly insufficient. And so, again, that was decisions by the bishop on priorities for allocation of funding that led to those inequalities. So it goes back to the point that the bishop has this really almost pervasive influence over how well safeguarding is done, because that's directly linked in some cases to how much resource there was. Data collection analysis. So we wanted lots of things. So we asked lots of questions around how many open cases were there at present across different dioceses, how many cases have been closed in the last 1, 2, and 3 years, how many appeals have been made, and where were they in the process. And on none of those did we get a response church-wide. And in individual dioceses, we got partial answers from most, with huge gaps in them. And no diocese was able to provide all of the answers to all of the questions we've asked. Now, if you think about that, if you don't know what the state of play is, how many cases you have open, how many cases you've closed, what the results of that were, and how many people have appealed against that process, then it's no wonder that your safeguarding at the end of the day is way below par. But more importantly, there's no way of tracking how safeguarding is improving, or indeed tracking where perpetrators of abuse might be being moved around and shifted from pillar to post, which I'll come on to in a moment. So real issue with data collection. Inappropriate use of safeguarding resources I've already talked about. Very common to use them on HR issues. Very common to use them to pursue things that at congregational level were nothing to do with the church whatsoever. It shouldn't have been investigations the church was doing, HR or otherwise. And then finally, the lack of independent scrutiny. So the church argued quite hard with us that they do have independent scrutiny because they issue contracts for outside organisations to come in and do audits. But our view was that wasn't independent, because the scope of that audit, where those audits took place, which diocese they took place in, which church in which diocese they took place on, or which cathedral, and the terms of reference for those were all controlled and issued by the diocese itself. So it was independent in the sense it wasn't church personnel carrying it out, but it was definitely not independent in the sense of that where it took place, the scope of it, the terms of reference, and how much money and resource was put into it was entirely at the discretion of the individual diocesan bishops, and remains that way to this day. That is not a comment on the effectiveness of the organisations that might have been contracted to do that. We didn't make a judgment of that, but it was a judgment that it can't possibly be independent if all those things are up to the discretion of the individual bishop. So one of the points that came up at the synod when it discussed this was last year, was several members of the synod raised concerns that there were no options in the paper that Alexis and I produced, that we'd gone straight to outsource it. That is not true. As we went through the process of listening to people, listening to detail around all those things I've just discussed, it became obvious to us that there was only one way to solve this, and that was to take the individual diocesan control out of the process. And the only way you can do that effectively is to give it to somebody completely outside of the church. And that is why we recommended what we did and didn't recommend any further actions. But Alexis and I are both really clear. We do not consider that anything other than full independent safeguarding and independent scrutiny is going to be sufficient to change practice and procedure in the church in terms of safeguarding. And I know it's sometimes boring to go on about practice and procedure, but it is good practice and good procedure that will start to fix this issue if it's done independently. Now, we recommended, as you know, 2 independent charities. And I just wanted to touch on, given that you've asked where I think it is now. So I've read the paper that's going to Synod, and I've read the different options, and I've read the option very carefully that they're recommending option 4 in the paper. And option 4 is, I would suggest, somewhere between 90 and 95% of the way towards the full independence that Alexis and I envisaged when we wrote the report. I just wanted to touch, Steve, on a couple of areas where it might seem on the face of it that it isn't fully independent, and explain why it is about as far as the church can go on its own. So they are recommending that all safeguarding professionals in the church are transferred to a new independent safeguarding body. They do not define that as a charity, but that doesn't matter. We're not tied. We think it's the better solution, but if it's a commercial organisation that's completely independent of the church and is properly assessed before it's given any contract, that's fine. So that's the first element of that, really. They are also recommending that the NST, where appropriate, are transferred either to that body, or if their role more closely matches something that would be done by the scrutiny body, to the scrutiny body. That the ability of bishops to interfere, if I could put it like that, in decision making the way that I've described, is removed by changing Canon 30. And that is the only, you alluded, Steve, earlier to the fact the church can make its own law. Because the church is set up as a number of different charities, I mean, we were shocked to learn that every parish is an independent charity within that overall charitable structure of the church, and every diocese is a charity. And so charity law says that one of the key tenets of charity law is the overall trustees cannot give up strategic responsibility for anything that charity is responsible for carrying out. So in terms of policy making around safeguarding and those overarching policies, the church commissioners can't give that up. That would require an act of the UK Parliament or the Westminster Parliament. But the church are saying that what they would do is change canon law so that bishops were required. At the moment, it says they have to have regard to the professional advice of a safeguarding officer, but can disregard it if they feel it's overridden by other issues within the diocese. They're proposing to amend canon law so that the bishop has to follow the instructions either of the operational body or the scrutiny body, or both. And they are making that, they're proposing that they change canon law so that there is essentially no option. And it says that policy making ultimately has to be endorsed by the church commissioners, because charity commission law requires that's where that's made. And they've got a number of mitigations in place that would mean that essentially what policy was driven by the recommendations made by the operational body and the oversight body, recommending to the church commissioners what they did. That is not ideal, but if we delay this to wait for the UK Parliament to find space to change law, and even if they were minded to change law, because if they change it for church charity commissioners, that I suspect there'd be a knock-on effect on other charities overseen by the Charity Commission, then we were waiting 3 years before that legislation is passed and anything happens at all. So our take on this is option 4 is about 90 to 95% of the way to the full independent safeguarding that Alexis and I recommended. Where there are weaknesses, the church are proposing to amend canon law to change those weaknesses to compel bishops to comply. That is not the same as having a law that says it's nothing to do either with the church commissioners or with bishops. But we can't go any further than that without that parliamentary change. The other thing that they'll need to change Canon 30 on is that a bishop, the power to appoint a diocesan safeguarding officer rests with the bishop. And so the way they're proposing to get around that, again, is to change Canon 30 to say that the bishop has to appoint the person that is recommended and put forward by the new operational safeguarding body. But the formal recognition of that person as the diocesan safeguarding officer would still have to be made by the bishop, but they're saying we're going to change canon law so that he or she has no choice other than to take that recommendation. I haven't discussed this part with Alexis because we haven't had a chance to talk in the middle, but my gut says we should accept that and then campaign for the final law change in the UK Parliament to follow on from that, to make it absolutely clear it's independent, but not wait for that to be done before we we take the 5 steps towards independence that are contained in option 4. The reason I've
Brilliant.
taken trouble to explain that is we are saying they should, we think they should progress, recommend, and take forward option 4. It's going to take 2 years to establish these bodies anyway, to do all the GP transfers, we can be talking to UK Parliament about that in parallel, rather than waiting for all things to fall into place before we start that discussion around independence. So my take is that if they go with option 4 and they get on with it, in 2 years' time, we should start to see the beginnings of real independence creeping into church safeguarding, because we'll have 2 competent bodies starting to take responsibility for it. There's a big caveat to this, however, and then I promise I'll stop. It isn't just the creation of the independent bodies that's important. At every step of this process, if you like, the transition process, the church must not be involved at any point. We must not have the selection of the appropriate bodies or the composition of the board of trustees of those new charities, or the composition of the board of directors if they go for a commercial organisation, being designated by the church. Now, obviously, they may want to have a trustee on each board as the church representative, and that would not be unreasonable. But we must make sure that at every stage, the way this is done, the way that it is overseen, the way that it was set up, the way that selections are made is independent. And my suggestion would be that they have a sort of transition board made up of all the sorts of people that we've talked about, survivors and everybody else, giving that advice about how they make that transition from where they are now to eventual full independence. Without that, there's a real danger, given what we found when we looked at this, that actually we start seeing weaknesses creep in, because bishops start to control who sits on the board of trustees. Bishops start to control which bits of canon law get changed and which bits don't get changed. So the big caveat to the church paper is that it's all concentrating on how you get from where you are now to the creation of the bodies. It's very light on what that transition process looks like and who's in charge of that transition process. And I think for it to have the confidence of everybody, but particularly those in the church that have survived abuse, that it is truly established as independent, that independent transition process must be one of the first key points they look at. Indeed, as soon as they take this decision, then that should be the end of the church's role in establishing independence. They should immediately, in my view, establish an independent process and an independent panel of people to oversee that. I hope that gives a reasonable overview from the point of the report.
That's hugely helpful. Thanks, John. I suspect we may come back to one or two of your points in questions shortly. Can I move to you, Matt, on this fundamental point of sitting here today, February 2025? How do you assess safeguarding in the church? How safe do you think the church is, and how has it got to where it is now?
Thank you. I would like to say something about accountability, really, which is disturbing me. You would think that after all these reviews, all these reports, after IICSA, there would be better accountability. And yet we've seen recently, Justin Welby resigned. Yeah, okay, over whatever happened in that case and his role in it. But now we've got Stephen Cottrell, which a lot of people are wanting to resign. There's been a poll which is 37,000 online that said he should go. There've been many reports in the media, David Tudor, the Bishop of Liverpool, Glenn Webster, all of which Cottrell's, Stephen Cottrell, the Archbishop of York, has been involved in and criticised for. And yet I feel that he is setting a new precedent himself. He has said only today in the Times he is not going to go. He is not going to resign. And just that simple thing really says you can do, still says you can do what you want. You know, we've heard of the David Tudor reports. He's not held accountable. We've heard the Bishop of Liverpool and what happened with the Crown's Nomination Commission. And I'm still not going to go. He didn't take action against Glenn Webster, a bishop who has ignored 2 disclosures. It is reported in 2 reports of having ignored disclosure abuse, and he won't act against him. And yet he said, I'm not going. Now, how far does this feed down onto other bishops? You know, he is setting the precedent to me again, a new precedent as the Archbishop. Do what you want. You don't have to resign. You don't have to move. You don't have to go. And there's a big, big problem. We saw it all similarly. It's like being publicly exposed, yet we'll carry on regardless. They're still not listening and taking account. The Bishop of Oxford is the same. Only last year, and this was in my review case, he was reported to have ignored, it was actually 4 disclosures of abuse, but he was reported in the review that found evidence of 3, of which he admitted, and the priest abuser in his diocese killed himself on the day he was due in court. No risk assessments done, anything like that. And yet Croft, we discover, is on the Crown Nominations Commission regarding the Bishop of Liverpool. Is it safe to have somebody on that? They were talking about when they're looking for a new Archbishop of Canterbury, to find somebody who really doesn't have any baggage. Well, if one of the persons who was on that on the Crown nominations has himself and recent being criticised, should he even be on there? This attitude again of you effectively being caught out, you've been publicly exposed, and yet we carry on. We're not going to resign, we're not going to do anything. I think a new precedent has been set here. With General Synod, I think a lot of people are deeply concerned, but I suspect a lot of them also feel powerless. I think there's a lot of talk about the General Synod having power, but when it comes down to it, that power's very, very watered down. And I think the hierarchy just walk all over them. My own personal view, I think Cotterell's walking all over victims and laughing in their face at the moment. So how have things improved? I actually think it's took a step backwards. I think it's got worse.
Thanks, Matt. We'll come back to some of those points, I'm sure. Gavin, if I move to you next, and maybe because you're going the last out of our 4 on this particular question, and from your experience, perhaps you could just add a little bit about whether General Synod, what sort of authority General Synod has, what members of General Synod may be doing now, a matter of days before they have to start debating these things from your perspective. But, you know, where does the church stand now from your perspective, Gavin?
Thank you, Steve. And can I start by thanking you all for taking part in this webinar. It's a privilege to be able to address you on a very esteemed panel, and particularly to be alongside Matthew Ineson. So thank you all for that. The Church of England's big problem in terms of safeguarding is that it doesn't know what it means. And it thinks that safeguarding is about safeguarding the church and protecting the church's reputation, the church's structures, and so on and so forth. I've agreed with a lot of what's been said. Some of the things I'm going to say are going to contradict John O'Brien, for which I apologise, but I don't criticise him. I think he's wrong on a couple of points. I don't criticise him for that. He's wrong because the Church of England is such a complicated animal. We don't need Parliament to change the law to create an Act of Parliament in relation to the church, because in 1919 Parliament devolved lawmaking power to the Church of England. We have canon law, which is one form of law, which is very simple for the synod to pass by itself, and then there's another form of ecclesiastical law called measures. Measures have the same status of an Act of Parliament, and a measure passed by the General Synod can even amend an Act of Parliament, and Church of England measures frequently do. So the Church of England General Synod does have the power to bring that law change that's necessary. One of the things that the Church of England does in downplaying abuse is to gaslight people. And they will say, we're doing this, but in reality, they will go and do something else. So the Future of Church Safeguarding report that we've spoken about, Professor Alexis Jay and John were commissioned to do that. When the archbishops announced that Professor Jay and John had been commissioned to do the report, they also said that when the report is published, they will go back to Alexis Jay to find out how to implement it. They didn't. Before the report was even with the Archbishop's Council set up a response group to water down the proposal. So we're talking about option 4, option 4, option 3, option 2, option 1 do not appear in Professor Jay's report. They are proposals put together by the response group to ensure that the church retains control. One of the ways they do this is through legal advice. Now, if you're going to do something significant, you want legal advice. The Future of Church Safeguarding report contained with it, brilliantly, legal analysis. So there was the report, and then there was a legal opinion as an appendix to the report. The proposals that the response group are coming to the synod with next week is supported by more legal analysis, this time by the Church of England's own in-house lawyers. But some of the dioceses don't want independence, and so the Diocese of Gloucester has commissioned their own legal advice to basically say, well, we can't do option 4, we can't have independence because of the things that have been mentioned, that charities can't relinquish their safeguarding obligations and duties and so on. And they're trying to use that to push away from option 4. Except legal advice can only tell you what the law says. If the General Synod passes a measure, they change the law. And so therefore, unless the legal advice tells you what the law is going to be, then legal advice saying you can't do this because the law says you can't, well, you change that law. And in the process of passing a measure, that's what will happen. The IICSA report, John's previous work, made a number of recommendations, and the Church of England, the Archbishop's Council, said, we are accepting these recommendations in full. So how many have they implemented? None. I think there's only one recommendation from IICSA that's has actually been implemented by anybody, and it's not quite there, and that's the age of consent in relation to people in a position of trust. It's not quite as IICSA said, but I'm pretty sure I'm correct in saying that that's pretty much the only one that's been acted on. And to be fair, the Church of England did pressure the government and said this needs to happen, and it's so clergy, teachers, sports coaches, and so on are there. But one of the other recommendations that came from IICSA was that the diocesan safeguarding advisors should become diocesan safeguarding officers with new powers. And the church will say, we've done this, we've amended one of the canon C30s, and we have all diocesan safeguarding advisors are now diocesan safeguarding officers. And that's true. But that's all they've done. They've changed the name. They haven't actually done anything to give them power to act as an officer. The main recommendation was IICSA wasn't about a change of name. It was about to give them more power and independence to be able to act regardless of what the bishop said to them. There were some changes coming through, but not much. We talked about the scrutiny, and the Church of England will say that we do these reports and so on and so forth. Now, in recent weeks, we've heard about the David Tudor case in Chelmsford. So I wanted to know what the review, there was a nationwide review called Past Cases Review, or Past Cases Review 2. And the reason there was the second Past Cases Review is they did the first Past Cases Review, and then it came out that actually they didn't actually review all the cases and so on. So we'll do it again. This time we'll do it properly. So I looked at the PCR2 report for Chelmsford to find out what he had to say about the David Tudor case. And there's nothing in there, except in the introduction, where it says that there were 3 cases known to the Diocese of Chelmsford that they are excluding from the PCR2 report. And the PCR2 reviewers therefore didn't get to see anything about it because it had already been reviewed by the National Safeguarding Team and judged to be okay. Well, they judged to be okay until it came out in the media on Radio 4 exactly what had happened in the David Tudor case. And for those that don't know, he's somebody who safeguarding risk assessments had identified that he posed a serious risk. He had been convicted, but then acquitted on appeal on a technicality because 3 separate cases should have been dealt with separately under the law at the time. They were dealt with together, and so he was acquitted on appeal. But the actual facts in relation to his abuse were not actually disputed. What was disputed there was about age of consent and so on. But his behaviour wasn't disputed. And Stephen Cottrell said he took everything possible to manage the risk, and it was an intolerable situation. And as soon as he could act, he acted. Except that's not true, because it's later transpired that Stephen Cottrell extended David Tudor's license twice. Stephen Cottrell made him a canon of Chelmsford Cathedral, and at a public service at which children were present, Stephen Cottrell referred to him as a Rolls-Royce priest and told everybody what a wonderful job he is. So it's gaslighting. They will, something will come out. They'll say, "Oh, we're doing all we can," and then they don't actually do anything. One of the things that the Synod will do next week is replace the clergy discipline measure with a new measure called the clergy conduct measure. And the clergy discipline measure does need replacing. This is the law that sets out how allegations against clergy are investigated and so on. Under the old system, once you've gone past the preliminary scrutiny stage, the complaint is given to the designated officer, who's a barrister employed by the Church of England, to investigate and prepare a report for the president of tribunals. And if the president of tribunals says, yes, this should go to a tribunal, the designated officer, the church house barrister, is the prosecutor. Under the new system, the designated officer is gone, and there's now a investigations and tribunals team that will do the investigation, prepare the report for the president of tribunals, and prosecute the case. Go to the small print, who are the investigations and tribunal team. They are lawyers employed by Church House in London. So nothing has changed other than the name, but they will use this, talk to the media and talk to survivors and talk to campaigners and talk to politicians and say, we're replacing this, we've got a new system coming into place, it's all going to be wonderful. And all they've done is change the name. They've done some other things. So in the case last week in the Bishop of Liverpool, the Bishop of I've forgotten the C, but Bev Mason is the bishop in area bishop in the Liverpool diocese, and she's revealed that she's the person who made the complaint. Because the complaint was beyond 12 months, she needed permission from the president of tribunals, and the deputy president of tribunals took the decision and he said no. That is something that will change, because that 1 year action or time limit for serious complaints, they're referring to them as, will disappear. I don't want to talk for too long, but there's a couple of things I wanted to go forth as well. So something else coming to the General Synod next week is a new clergy risk assessment regulations. Now, the case of David Tudor in Chelmsford, and another case that was on Radio 4 earlier last year, I think about October, November time, was the case of Canon Andrew Hindley. Now, the church, we are told from the BBC Radio 4 investigation, spent about 3 decades trying to remove him from his post because he was known to pose a safeguarding risk. And they couldn't because the legal powers weren't there to do it. And one of the things that Stephen Cottrell has repeatedly said, and the Church of England and the Archbishop's Council have repeatedly said, is we're learning the lessons and we're going to change this. And next week at General Synod, a whole raft of new safeguarding things are going to come in. It's going to get better. The new safeguarding regulations, clergy risk assessment regulations rather, it's just little tweaks. It means that the diocesan safeguarding officer, this is one of the things that will give them more power. The diocesan safeguarding officer can commission the risk assessment and so on, and the bishop can't overrule him and so on. So that is going some way towards what IICSA said. The problem is when a risk assessment comes back and says the Reverend Joe Bloggs is a serious safeguarding risk to children or vulnerable adults, then what happens? The bishop has no power to do it, to do anything about it. He can't limit his ministry. He can't, if he's an incumbent, he can't remove him from post. David Tudor in Chelmsford, the local authority banned him from working in schools and visiting schools, and yet he was able to carry on as a parish priest because the church didn't have the power. So we have new clergy risk assessment regulations coming in next week, and they don't address the fact that the bishop has no power, the diocesan safeguarding officer has no power, the national safeguarding team has no power. Nobody has the power to prevent risk if a risk assessment says that somebody poses a risk. But again, the Church of England will gaslight and say, we're changing it, we're improving things, we're doing all this thing. They're not. And I think part of the problem is in terms of what do we do now? Where does the Church of England go? Is that the Church of England is stuck. It's got itself into a rut that it can't get out of. I left the General Synod in July 2023 because it became very clear to me. I was elected on a platform of transforming safeguarding in the Church of England. That was my platform. In the elections in 2021, a lot of the election addresses were, we're going to campaign for keeping same-sex marriage banned in the Church of England, or we're going to campaign to allow same-sex marriage in the that was the main election battleground. For me, the real issue wasn't that, it was safeguarding, and that's why I stood. But the Business Committee of the General Synod, which is controlled by the Archbishop's Council, misused standing orders to prevent debate. I had 2 debates on safeguarding over my short time on General Synod, both of which were called short without a vote before the end of the debate, because the Archbishop's Council members said, no, we can't risk this going ahead. And I think the Church is beginning to realise now that if they'd listened to survivors, if they'd listened to victims, campaigners, advocates and others, maybe they wouldn't be in this mess. But they're still not blaming themselves. So in the case last week with the Bishop of Liverpool, Steve Cottrell, and I'm trying not to do a Stephen Cottrell bashing session here, but he does have his fingerprints on a lot of the Church of England safeguarding scandals because of his management of them. In a statement last week, he blamed the victim in Chelmsford Diocese for not making a formal complaint. She has made a complaint. She's gone to the police, she's made statements, she's reported it to the priest. Victims should not have to make formal complaints and go through the formal structures. That's the job of archdeacons and bishops. And for him, even now, after all the criticism and scrutiny he's faced over recent weeks and months, and particularly since Justin Welby stood down, but even before, for him still to come out with a statement now where he's got new external PR advisors helping him to steer his way through the mire, for him to still come out with a statement blaming a victim for the fact that the Church of England hasn't responded properly, I think is outrageous. And until we get proper independence of management of safeguarding allegations and investigations with proper power to take action, the Church cannot get itself out of this rut.
Thanks, Gavin. We're getting some really in-depth insights here, ladies and gentlemen, as you'll see, and some questions are starting to come in. I want to just take this opportunity to move across to first Jaswinder and then Matthew. I mean, essentially what we've heard from John and Gavin about the mechanics, the complexity of trying to fix safeguarding in a complex institution. I'm interested in, from your experiences, what do survivors take away from this complexity, this debate, this challenge about trying to fix things? Where do survivors stand in this from your perspective?
Well, listening to John and listening to the fact that the weakness of it could take 3 years, survivors don't have 3 years. I'm just reading a letter from a survivor here. In fact, this has been signed by 85 survivors, sent to me in April 2023. Post IICSA, we are echoing what we have always known, and even after spending a whole year sharing our testimonies to IICSA, the casualties are victims and survivors of church abuse. We are the casualties. And repeatedly I'm hearing this. And I just cannot fathom how Justin Welby and Stephen Cottrell, whom David Glasgow writes a report, Professor David Glasgow, about the re-traumatization. Yes, they replied to me in January last year. This is urgent. This is terrible, Jaswinder. This clinical psychologist is telling us that these victims have been re-traumatized by the fact that we closed down the ISB and we didn't let survivors know, despite you, Steve, contacting William Knight to say, please give us time to tell the survivors, you know, they've had nothing. Open letters to both of these leaders. The survivors have had nothing in the last 4 months. I'm just disillusioned by the fact that it is a wound that is very open and very raw. They cannot say they do not know about this. Daily, victims and survivors' lives are being impacted by the lack of safeguarding, the lack of urgency in relation to the need to improve this area. Fed up of apologies, fed up of saying, you know, every time I hear Stephen Cotterill, any other leader say, we have to think about the victims and survivors, don't forget them. And also being referred to, any campaigner speaking about this is referred to as a shouty person. That's what Stephen Cotterill referred to us as. Well, we will keep on shouting until you listen to what we're saying, because the devastation in my time of doing this, from being appointed as the independent survivor advocate to the point of acting as a volunteer in the last 2 years, is I hear about suicide ideation. I've heard of suicides. I hear of the devastation in these people's lives, not only to them, but their families. And they are meant to be the most compassionate organisation, I'm sorry. But when I look at the chat in there and listening to you, Gavin, it feels to me that there is a way to do this without waiting for 3 years. So get on with it, is what I would say.
Thanks, Jazz. Matt, I'm conscious you're decades into living with the experience of trying to get justice from the church. How does all this feel from your perspective?
Well, stripping things really back, of course, if you've got to want to change, and the church has been fighting change in safeguarding for such a long time. The very fact that the 1 year rule, that infamous 1 year rule that they used in my case, bishops are still willing to use to protect themselves, does not mean to say that they are victim-centred, does it? And another recent example we heard of John Sentamu earlier on, you know, I think the Bishop of Newcastle was absolutely right in her actions. With regard to John Sentamu, what was the response of the Archbishops of Canterbury and York? It was to try write to her and effectively bully her into allowing him back into ministry. And at the very same time, I can remember this on social media, Stephen Cotterill said about being victim-centred. Victims must always be involved and taken into account. Well, in that letter that went to the Bishop of Newcastle, the focus was all about bringing Sentamu back into ministry, and I wasn't mentioned once. Not once. There was no account for the victim at all. All they were bothered about was him. It takes me back to my original point. If you want to change, you've got to want to change. You've got to want to say what's acceptable, what isn't acceptable. I don't think they've changed at all. I think they've took steps backwards. And that continues today, which I made in points earlier. I totally agree with Jaswinder. You know, I speak to many, many, many victims, and the suffering, the hurt that is caused by the church and has been for years and carries on to this very day is wicked. It cannot be described as any other. If you want to care for somebody properly, you would.
Thanks, Matt. That's really powerful. Thank you. I'm conscious the point you made, Matt, about wanting to change. One of the issues Jaswinder and I on the Independent Safeguarding Board, of course, experienced was that you have to be willing to be scrutinised as well as appointing people to scrutinise you. There's a couple of questions here about how practically it is possible for an organisation to appoint people to a body. You know, how does an organisation create a body and maintain its sort of independence? I wonder whether, John, you might be able to just give us a few thoughts about how the mechanics of that could plausibly work in the real world.
Yep.
John, if I may, can I mind just quickly coming in, because I'm mindful of the fact survivors are leaving messages in the group that are being affected, and they're asking, and they're giving case examples of being dropped by the NST. So Steve, can you just give our website out for people to email at our website, and then we can, I'll be happy to respond to them as part of the ISB 11 group and welcome them into our group, if you don't mind. Sorry, John, I don't want to be rude. I just wanted, I'm mindful of the fact that I can see people coming in and being affected.
Sure. Yeah, so anyone, if we don't get to questions today, is very welcome to message us at independentsafeguarding.org. There's a contact page there, and those messages are only accessed by either Jaswinder or I, so you can email there comfortably knowing who's going to look at that.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt you, John.
Yeah, so a couple of quick things. The sort of dispute between what the church can do and what UK Parliament do are made simply because if it is charities that are involved, I suspect the state would have a very strong view on the church making a change to the law that would affect not only church commissioners but all commissioners. And secondly, if the church can change it one way, they can change it back later. So I still feel that overall it'd be better to get it in place with the less perfect solution and get the one that means the church can't change their mind later in place. I just think that's the right way to do it. But I was very clear when I talked about this, and I do think it would take 2-3 years to get from start to finish to the new organisation being fully established. However, that is why I was very careful to say that they need to appoint, the day after they make this decision, assuming they go for option 4, an independent transition team to come in and start changing things from the day after synod. But the reality of creating an organisation and transferring staff to it, because staff will, many staff, their job will be so similar, they'll be protected by TUPE. These are all practical things, but that's why I'm really clear it can't be left to the church to determine that timetable. There needs to be a transition team in. People need, survivor advocates need to be on that transition team, and we need to work out what you do in the period between the church agreeing option 4 and the full establishment of both bodies. I didn't mean to suggest for one moment that there was this 2-year hiatus when nothing happened. There's a lot that can happen with a transition team, and I think the sooner the church make that decision, I hope they're ready on the day after to go with that transition team and make sure that what I talked about in terms of the way that people are appointed to that is nothing to do with the church whatsoever. They need to be talking to people about how, people like Jaswinder and others can help with making sure the establishment of that transition board is both quick, efficient and independent. So that's the way I think you really kickstart this process. You put in place people that can put practical changes in place immediately, whilst the legal and technical processes of transferring power from the church to the two independent bodies is made. And I will certainly continue to advocate alongside this to get UK Parliament to change law in a way that means it cannot later be changed back by the church because you've got a new archbishop in place who has a different view. We saw so much of this with changing bishops and safeguarding policy that I really think the safest bet is to get UK Parliament to do it once, and then only UK Parliament can unpick that. So I hope that's made it clear, Gavin, why my preference is for UK government to do it. Even if the church offered to do it, I'd still be worried that in 5 years' time, there'd be another synod and it'd be changed again. And does it answer your question, Jaswinder, about how we act quickly in terms of getting the transition panel in place and getting people on that can really have the authority to start doing all of the things that you and Matthew and Gavin in particular are talking around bringing survivors truly into the middle of this transition, but acknowledging it will be a transition. I think we have to acknowledge there will need to be a process of transitioning to the really bad safeguarding that exists now to the independent, hopefully much better safeguarding that will exist once everything is established. And my point was really, really clear to have that body in place to start to dispel some of these bad practices from day one after synod.
Thanks, John. I'm acutely aware that we offered people an opportunity to listen to us for 60 minutes on these issues, and we've gone into some great depth and we've gone just over our time. I think there may well be an opportunity for us to hold another event like this relatively shortly. to understand a little bit more about these issues, perhaps with the understanding and hindsight for what Synod might have decided next week. I wanted to just reiterate Jaswinder's point. You're perfectly welcome to contact us at independentsafeguarding.org. There's a contact form there that you can get in touch with Jaswinder or I about any of these issues, particularly if you're a survivor and in need of some support or direction. That's not an emergency contact support place, but actually it's somewhere where we can link you together with some of the advocacy work that's been happening more generally. I also wanted to flag to you the opportunity to make a donation at that website as well. We haven't charged for this webinar, but if you wanted to make a donation at independentsafeguarding.org/donate, you're very welcome to. And any resource that you allocate to that is spent in support of members of the ISP 11, which is the survivors that were left after the Independent Safeguarding Board was abolished, and other church survivors. If you are a survivor of abuse, or it's difficult for you to listen to some of these discussions for other reasons, please do take care of yourself. Self-care is important. Make sure you've got support around you, or reach out to people if you need that. I'll just thank our panel of Gavin, John, Jaswinder and Matt for their insights and their time. I suspect we will come back to these points at some point, and there'll be another opportunity to discuss them. But thank you very much to the panel, and thank you to the well over 100 people who have joined us for this webinar. It's great to see so much concern about these issues, and we look forward to welcoming you to the next event. Thanks very much, everybody.